Welcome to the Lorecast, where we look into the lore and the stories by which we live. I'm Dr. Craig Chalquist, and you can find us at chalquist.com/podcast and at a number of other online venues. One of the most consistent findings in the social sciences, including psychology, is that where we come from has a massive influence on who we are, how we perceive ourselves, what our relationships are like, even what our work choices is like. There are plenty of examples of this. When you look at the research on identical twins, when they're separated at birth, they often have similar partner choices, similar career choices, their weight's about the same. That's the kind of research that I'm talking about. If you come from people who ancestrally have been driven out of their homeland, enslaved, and otherwise collectively traumatized, we know that you're at higher risk for some kind of an anxiety disorder. We know that child abuse can set people up for all kinds of psychological and physical mayhem later in their life. And we can see the influence of culture. Where you come from has a lot to do with how you show up in the world. One of the questions that atheists often ask religious people is, to use the example of Christianity, well, okay, you grew up in a Christian family, so you're a Christian, but if you had grown up in a Hindu family, you'd probably be Hindu. All of which is true to a point. And there's no denying these influences, these early influences. I could mention many other examples. Did your parents drink or use drugs? That's going to affect you, and so on and so forth. There's the whole psychological side that family systems illuminates. But I want to speak on the other side of this whole question. And it's about what we do with where we come from, that we're more than where we come from. So I'd like to talk a little bit about why that is. And in some ways, my position in life has allowed me a glance at this that I think goes a little bit deeper than other people's, only because I'm an adoptee who found his birth families after being put up for adoption under rather strange circumstances. So it has given me windows into how this whole question works in terms of where we come from. So I'm going to be speaking a lot from my own experience, but giving examples from other people's as well. Now, one of the nice things about being in my position is it allows you to compare who you are and who you were growing up with what was going on in your birth families, and you can look for both differences and similarities. We usually tend to look for the similarities. So, growing up, I was, and still am, very interested in Western classical music. I love it. Also like other things too, but I listen to classical music probably every day, and was puzzled by that. I liked it as a kid. I liked it even more after I went to college, and used to wonder about it because nobody in the family I was raised in really likes classical music. So, when I met my birth families, one of the first things I learned is that on the maternal side, my birth mother, my grandfather, and a lot of other people absolutely adore classical music. And in fact, my birth mother was a kind of piano prodigy early on. When my grandfather died, one of the things my birth mother said in a letter was to my aunt, she said, "I don't care about inheritance. I just want his Beethoven records." So it's an easy connection. I can see where that part of me came from. As for my birth father's side, I have a pretty good memory, and I get that from him, as well as his rather mellow, introverted temperament. My birth father was the kind of man you want to have around in an emergency because he did not panic. And It was just very calm and soothing in his manner, and I've been told that's how I am as well, and I don't panic either. I think in my whole life I panicked once, and it was when I was a teenager. And it was in a real disaster, so there was a reason to panic. But yeah, I get those things from him. So, but what about the "we're more than where you came from" part, right? Well, I do like classical music, but I also really like rock and roll. Been listening to it since I was a kid. That doesn't tend to show up in either family, actually. And my interest in psychology does show up. In fact, my mother worked for a time as a psychiatric social worker. My grandfather has an ed psych degree, but I've taken it in a completely new direction. I did work as a psychotherapist for a while, but I see myself more as offering a kind of, quote, therapy out in the world, out in the street, for our collective concerns, doing that in my own way, and nobody in my family's interested in that. My birth father, despite his natural calmness, underneath the hood also had a great deal of conflict and post-traumatic stress from battle. In fact, there were soldiers on in both families, birth and adoptive, and I've worked a lot as a counselor with combat vets and really enjoyed it. I like having them as students too. Because of coming from military families, we speak something of a common language, and I feel like I understand where they're coming from to the extent that I can understand it, but I never chose to walk that path of the literal warrior. The warrior in me has shown up in other ways instead. Carl Jung, in his autobiographical work Memories, Dreams, Reflections, makes a comment about how he feels like it was for him to address some of the questions that his ancestors left behind, and I feel that as well. And one of the questions is, how do we get beyond war? How do we show up peacefully? And this is a question I've wondered at for many years. The family I grew up in, my adoptive family, was violent. And one of the reasons I went into psychological training to begin with was because I was curious about why I didn't become violent myself. I certainly saw enough of it and experienced enough of it. And as a matter of fact, I spent some years as a young person studying the martial arts so that I could learn to defend myself and my family against my dad, which I did. But since the age of 18, I haven't struck anybody. And so why is it that some of us who come from violent families, and the violence statistically is almost always caused by men, although women, of course, can be violent too, but men overwhelmingly are the ones that commit domestic violence. But why didn't I become violent? And worked on that in therapy too. I got into therapy in my 30s, both because I was married and because I was in training to be a psychotherapist, and I needed to do that. It was required by the school, but I would have done it anyway. So looking at those questions. So you can see from these examples, and I can produce others that apply to other people, that although where we come from influences us, at some point there's always a choice. At some point there's always the opportunity for difference, for a different path. Here's another example. A lot of Christianity in my families. I grew up in the Christian Lutheran Church, was actually confirmed in it as a teenager. So a lot of religion in both families. And I'm not religious. Haven't been since college, actually. And I consider myself a spiritual person, especially in terms of eco-spirituality, feeling a sense of the sacred in the natural world. And I have spiritual practices that I do every day. And a sense of community, too, with people who have similar values. But I am definitely not religious. I probably never will be religious. I'm not a Christian anymore. although I continue to value a lot of what I learned when I was one as a younger person, when, before you get to choose, right? They whip it on you. But nevertheless, there were some useful lessons. In fact, I ended up writing a book called Wisdom Tales of the Gnostic Jesus, where I not only examined briefly in the beginning the traditional Jesus that we all grow up with who are Christians, but what was the Jesus like for this esoteric group of inward people called Gnostics? They tell very different stories. They're complementary, they're not necessarily contradictory, but their Jesus is very esoterically inclined. He teaches his disciples how to go on vision quests, for instance. He partners with Mary Magdalene on some of the teaching. He laughs, he dances, he's very different. None of which is present in my upbringing, and as far as I know, my ancestry. Some of this just unfolded naturally, but even when it did, my deviations from the paths that I walked as a child or that were laid before me by my families always involved decision points. And decisions are exactly what most social science ignores. In fact, when we commit to studying human nature with physical science methods, those methods are designed to eradicate subjectivity. They're designed to see everything from the outside only in terms of cause and effect. So, of course, they're blind to choice. They even may study it, but they study it as an object. And possibly the oddest thing of all from a social science perspective is that I never turned out to be a criminal. I probably should have been. My birth mother was an international smuggler. She was a definite underworld figure, carried a gun. She manipulated and schemed and was quite a colorful character in many ways. And my birth father had been, especially in the war, tremendously violent. He had very violent friends. I saw a lot of violence growing up at home, most of it from my dad. Had to defend myself against it, as I mentioned earlier. So I was really on a career track for acting out, and I did a little bit when I was younger. In fact, when I was in high school, a bully was picking on me and my friends at a time when I was also getting beat up at home. And so when I was, I think it was age 16, I confronted the bully at lunchtime and knocked him out. Knocked him out cold. And then, of course, got in trouble for that. And then I came back at night and set his locker on fire. So I have the strange distinction of having graduated from a school that I could have burned down. Fortunately, the police were patrolling that night, and they put the fire out and took me in, me and a couple of friends I was with. And so I did a semester in continuation school, which I actually enjoyed. I got to be on self-paced learning instead of plodding along like everybody else on the same old schedule. So I got all my stuff done early, all my work, and then I spent the rest of the semester reading Sherlock Holmes stories by Conan Doyle, which were influential. So at that point in my life, it might have looked like I was going down the dark path of some of my family members. And in fact, a friend of mine, his name was also Craig, he came from a similar family, and he ended up working for one of the U.S. intelligence agencies, and they actually interviewed me when I was in college as part of a security check for him. But the agent who came out asked me if I was interested in signing up. And by that time, I had started working on myself and realizing that I had a lot of anger to deal with, that I wasn't going in a good direction, and that I needed to change my life. And by the way, this was before therapy. And so I turned their offer down, never became a spook, and went my own path, which led in quite a different direction. In fact, a direction that wasn't really precedented in the families I grew up in. So I think the answer to the question of why did I turn out different, there's all kinds of factors we can take into account. But I think that the real answer is because I chose to be. I didn't want to be violent like both my fathers were, as well as other relatives in the family. I didn't want to live and work in the underworld. Instead of being on the side of complacency, going along, conformism, or even destructiveness, I wanted to be on the side of hope and creativity. I haven't always succeeded, but I think I've made a good effort at it because I chose to. When I started working years ago in men's groups and leading the groups too, and these were guys who had committed violent acts of different kinds, anywhere from assault up to murder, done their time, and then when they came out, they were ordered into mandatory counseling, and that's where they met me. Usually had them for a year, and so in those groups, I saw how badly prepared I had been by my rather traditional psychotherapy training, and fortunately got training from real experts who knew what they were doing. And one of the ideas that lamed me as a counselor at first was that our level of education, the things that we bring with us, the upbringing we came out of, determine how well we function. And it was amazing to me how therapists who considered themselves, on the side of free will and yeah, we set our own destiny and all that, how incredibly deterministic they could be on this issue and not even own it. And so I was told by well-meaning therapists, well, guys like that they're minimally functional. Some of them don't read, which was true. A lot of them dropped out of high school if they even got that far, which was true. And there's not that much you can expect. And I just think that's terrible. I went into group telling them, I do expect more from you. I expect you to be better men. And by and large, they stepped up to that. There was this one guy I remember really clearly who he had just been through it. I mean, we grew up poor and violent father, lots of jail time. And this guy, he accumulated a couple of absences right up front. And I don't know how it is nowadays, but in those days, the state of California allowed you 6 absences in a year. And if you did 7 absences, then back to jail you go. So he was up to 5. And I told him, you can't miss any more groups. You absolutely have to be here. I don't care what it takes. Sleep on the roof if you have to for the next couple of months until you graduate, right? Do whatever you need to do. And he said, yeah, okay. And, missed the next group. So back to jail he went. Now there was another guy with a very similar upbringing, profile, everything, right? Socioeconomics, and this guy didn't miss any groups at all, which was really unusual. In the course of a year, something would come up at work for most guys, or they'd get sick or something, Not this guy. He kept coming. And at one point I told him, I really appreciate how consistently you're here. You're always on time. You seem to be getting a lot out of the groups. And he said, I have nothing left. I've lost everything because of my violence. I lost my family, my wife, my kids won't talk to me. I got fired because I was arrested for a felony. I don't have anything left. These groups are all I have. And if I get one thing right in this life, it's going to be this. And afterwards, I was telling Scott, one of the guys that trained me, I would work for this guy for free. I mean, he's remarkable. but he doesn't show up on our chart of determinisms, When we say that people act in certain ways because of their upbringing, because they're riddled with conflicts or complexes, or they're mentally ill, or they may even have brain damage of some kind. Or today we would say they're neurodivergent in some ways, right? The question I'm asking is, what happens after all that? What happens when we've accounted for all that? Then what happens? What creative use can people make of their situation? What decisions can they make to move themselves forward in spite of these tremendous obstacles? And if we don't see people's potential to do that, we harm them, especially as mental health, quote, experts. So yes, we want to have realistic expectations for where people can go, but we always have to be prepared to be surprised and to abandon those expectations when people show up in different ways. There was a man who was a guest speaker in one of my classes when I was training to be a psychotherapist, and he had agreed to be there to talk to us for, I think, about 30 minutes. He was accurately diagnosed with schizophrenia, and he was a guy in his, I would say, mid-30s. Had been hospitalized numerous times, was on some medication. He had active delusions and hallucinations. In fact, when he came, he wore white, and he told us, I'm wearing white because I'm the Redeemer. And we went, okay, yep, he has schizophrenia. And so he talked about what it was like to have schizophrenia. So there was a meta level to what he gave us. He was able to step back from it a little bit. And what struck me the most about him was that there were several times during that presentation to our class where he would start to rant. And he would say things like, do you know that if I raise my arms, I can knock down every tree on the planet? And then he would collect himself and breathe for a minute and say, I've been told that the reality that I see is different from the reality that you see. And sometimes I forget that. And I thought, wow, this guy is just remarkable. He was not only a student in school, he was going to college, he was also holding down a part-time job. Wow. How dare we say that this guy's illness prevents him from making any kind of a contribution? He was a role model for me. I think he was the strongest man I ever met. I couldn't imagine what it would be like to have to haul yourself back from the abyss time and again, hour after hour, day after day. What an incredible amount of willpower that took. And he was also a genuinely spiritual man. He said, I pray for help. I can't do this by myself. He said, if it weren't for God and the help he provides, I couldn't get through a single day. And so he was not only a very strong man, he was also a very humble one. I mean, if that's not heroic, I don't know what is. So the truth that we have to face up to here is that in spite of all of our social science, all of our psychology, all of our research, we cannot calculate the possibilities of what someone may step up to someday because they choose to. The most we can say is that, well, it's likely that people who grew up this way or that way will end up such and such. But what about Sojourner Truth? What about Frederick Douglass? What about the thousands of people who grow up being brutally assaulted and decide that they will not go down that path themselves? That they will be better human beings than the ones who mistreated them. One of the reasons that I teach folklore and myth and folktales is because they have wisdom to offer us about complex issues. And I'm thinking of old Hasidic folktales about what in Yiddish are called the Lamed Vovnik. And the Vovniks are a group of people who are outwardly undistinguished. In fact, they're likely to be, if you did a profile on a Vovnik, they're likely to be poor or developmentally disabled somehow. They're never prominent people. They're not distinguished by their level of enlightenment. They're not successful usually by society's standards. They suffer tremendously. Some of them are street people. And one of the reasons they suffer is because they take upon themselves all of the vice and sin and ignorance of humanity. They are our counterweights. And so while on Earth, they're usually known as losers or people on the margins or what have you, down and outs, bums. The angels have a different title for them. They call them the people of perfect equilibrium because their suffering holds the entire world in balance, and it prevents God from destroying the world again out of despair over what we've done to it and to each other. According to the Talmud, there are also people who are called masters of return because they strayed from their path and came back again. And in the eyes of the angels, they stand higher than those who never left the path to begin with. So these kinds of storied ideas overturn our customary notions, our emphasis on health and wholeness and enlightenment and success and all that, all of which are good things to be sure, but they're not available to everyone. Which of course means that those of us who are successful and able-minded and able-bodied have an obligation to help the balance of things, the fairness of things in our own way. So the next time you hear yourself excusing your misbehavior with something like, well, I'm doing this because of how I was raised, or I'm doing this because of my parents, or because of this, or because of that, you might want to add a little mental correction and say, and because I choose to. Even if that choice is only half conscious or unconscious, you're still making it, which means that you can make a different choice. You can take a different path right now. Right now. From this moment onward, everything can be different if you choose for it to be. That doesn't mean the path you take will be easy by any means. In fact, if you've avoided it for this long, it'll probably be quite difficult, at least at first. But it's encouraging to think that a new path lies open at every moment, because it does. I was recently in San Diego sitting on a breakwater at twilight, and a drunk woman came up to me, and we struck up a conversation. And she mentioned that her name was Jennifer, and she was aware that her name harks back to Guinevere, the great queen of Camelot, whose story has treated so badly. And I told her that Camelot fell because Arthur disrespected Guinevere, and that she brought the round table. So I don't know if this woman will remember anything that we talked about or make a different choice when she comes out of her hangover. But I hope so, because the possibility is always there for all of us under any circumstances. Thank you.